This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Well, Paul, welcome to the Human Action Podcast.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's take care of this at the beginning. On Twitter/X a while ago at this point, I saw somebody announcing that, these two Harvard economists have a paper that involves Böhm-Bawerk, and I went and looked at it in the abstract. Right away, it jumped out. It was talking about the average period of production, and we'll come back to this, folks, in a minute and say, well, that's a controversial element in Böhm-Bawerkian thought. And I made some snarky remark about even when the mainstream's interested in us, they focus on the one thing that modern Austrians no longer, dwell on. And so I want to formally apologize that I was just being snarky. And thanks for coming here. And this is amazing that we've got two Harvard economists and have this, the draft I'm looking at is 103 pages of a paper about Austrian capital theory embedded in international trade, and it's under review at the AER, which is arguably top journal in the world. So this is a very special event. So of course, folks, Paul was nice enough to come here and talk about it. Before we get into the paper, though, or the draft, Paul, can I just ask you just a little bit about your background? Because I'm just curious. So you grew up in Spain and then went to MIT. Can you explain, over in Spain, what is MIT known for? Does it have what's the reputation? Is it considered ideological? Because coming from the right-wing Austrian perspective, we have our views of MIT, but I'm just curious in general for a young person going in economics in Spain, how they view MIT.
Right. So, I'm not too sure how things are now. We're talking, sadly, we're talking about more than 25 years ago. So obviously things change. The short answer to your question is that back in 98, 99, when I was deciding, MIT was simply not known. Okay. So, I don't think that most people pay as much attention to academic institutions in the U.S. as people here in the U.S. would. Now, obviously, I was at a very good university in Barcelona, and the folks that had taught me knew about it and had views about it. But there was no sense in which ideology mattered too much in that decision. There were views that Chicago, it's sort of, I think it was more about the freshwater macro versus New Keynesian macro, less so about more right or left type of stuff. But the short answer is that I had a hard time convincing my parents that this was a good decision. Not because of ideology, but simply they didn't
object to the Cambridge Capital controversy.
Exactly. They could not understand why, having been admitted to Harvard, for instance,
right.
I was deciding to go to a place with an acronym that they had never heard about. So that's the short answer.
Okay, well then, if you don't mind me asking, why did you? So you could have gone to Harvard to get your degree, instead you chose MIT?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. So the short answer is, I don't know how short, but Harvard admitted me, I think, in part because I had a Fulbright scholarship. So I don't think we operate this way anymore here at Harvard. But back in the day, if you had some financial aid from back home, that gave you a little bit of an advantage. And I was elated, right? But then MIT admitted me, and I started talking to some people back in my university that were telling me, that's actually the best PhD program, technically, blah, blah, blah. That's where you want to go. And MIT, I don't know why exactly they saw something in. I felt like they did really see something in me, and they offered me, without even me asking for it, a full ride, basically. And they said, look, we want you to come here. We think that when you finish your PhD, you will want to stay in the US and be an academic in the US. And the Fulbright scholarship has some ties. And we don't want you to take it because we want you to be able to choose in what was 4 years down the line. And that was very persuasive. I went to Harvard and I told them, look, that's what they're telling me there. I'd love to come to Harvard maybe, but that's obviously there's no strings attached. after I finished at MIT. And Harvard, obviously, because probably my ranking was not all that high, I had been admitted precisely because of the funding. They basically said, well, you have a Fulbright. If you want to come here, use a Fulbright. So that's there were many other things, right? And MIT is really a fantastic PhD program, and I'm not sure what I would have decided under equal financial packages. But, obviously, if you can make a decision without tying your future, that's sort of, and that's what I did. And it was clearly the right decision, exposed in terms of, I had a blast there, the great program, and God only knows what would have happened if I had gone elsewhere, of course.
Right. Okay, great. So then my next sort of just warm-up question here before we dive into the paper is, how did you get interested in, Böhm-Bawerk and I guess capital theory more generally, but like specifically in the Austrian-Bawerkian tradition? Because I imagine at MIT they weren't courting you saying, yes, we definitely want someone to come here because there's a hole in our department that no one's working on Böhm-Bawerk.
No, this came much later. It came much earlier and much later. And earlier in the sense that I would imagine that relative to the median academic economist in U.S. universities, I'm perhaps a bit more versed in the history of economic thought. When I did my undergrad in economics in Spain, as you may know, there's much more specialization there. So I took dozens, literally like more than 40 courses on economics, and less on other things. And one of those courses was on the history of economic thought, which was taught by a very entertaining individual who had been in politics. And he was obsessed with Schumpeter and the Austrian school. He was one of the introducers of Schumpeter's ideas into Spain in the 50s, 60s, etc. And so he did a very entertaining course on the history of economic thought, and we talked about Menger and Böhm-Bawerk and Schumpeter and Hayek, Mises, etc. Right. So I had a familiarity of where the school, at least up to the 1950s, 60s, where it fit in the history of economic thought. And I knew how important it had been for like neoclassical economics, for instance. And I've regularly kept sort of reading history of economic thought. Now, that's like way back, right? Now, then you have like 20 years of my career that are focused on very different things. I've been working on models of global production, multinational firms, contract theory applied to general equilibrium models. Very little capital theory, and certainly not a lot of sort of history of economic thought. But then 2019, I think, so not that long ago, I was in Vienna. And I go to Vienna regularly because my wife is from Bratislava, which you may know is maybe 40 miles from Vienna. So I spent chunks of the summer there, and I co-organized with a good friend of mine there a conference every year where we bring up a bunch of international trade economists and have a couple of days of seminars. And I was always amused how folks go there. I don't know if you've been to Vienna, but it's sort of for young folks that maybe don't like fully appreciate the history of the city. They're shocked just how monumental the city is, right? It's like, wait, Austria's a small country. Why does it have this absolutely stunning capital? And then you explain a bit about the empire and this and that. And then you're like, well, but, we're having this at the University of Vienna. This is the cradle of like modern economics. And so we were having sort of these discussions, and over dinner, we were having the discussion of just the importance of the Austrian school for the development of economics. And a local professor there recommended a book, which is cited in the footnote of this paper that you mentioned, which is I wrote it because I always forget names, Yannick Wassermann's. I don't know if you've read this book. It's The Marginal Revolutionaries, How Austrian Economists Fought the War of Ideas. Okay. So I read that in 2000, during COVID, actually. And I found it, some of the stuff I knew, but some of the stuff I hadn't fully appreciated. It was a fascinating read, and that sort of started reading the chapters on Böhm-Bawerk and like remembering what he was working on, and it just sort of made a lot of sense. This notion of thinking hard about the temporal dimension of production, thinking about the role of sort of time and sort of not only as a sort of a cost of time in the traditional way, but sometimes something that is necessary, that is productivity enhancing. And having thought a lot about sequential production processes and how they become global, I felt there was some concepts there that seemed potentially important that I hadn't seen in the type of formal work that I typically I'm involved with. So that sort of led me to think, I do this with this, but many other topics. I see what's happening in the world, and as an academic, that I paid to think. Well, we think, right? So what's happening? How do I think about it? What is the framework in my toolkit that I'm going to grab to understand this? Most of the time, I have a framework. We can debate whether it's the right one or not, but I have a way to understand this, to make sense of this, to criticize it or to praise it, to be worried about it or to be excited about it. But in this particular ideas, I didn't know about a formal model that would sort of capture that, and that led me down that path.
Okay, great. Yeah, and to answer your question, I saw you cite that book and sort of given the history in the paper as to like what led us down this path, and I haven't read that particular book, so I'll have to check that out. That's interesting. I have been to Vienna. I was there one time. I gave some kind of a presentation in actually I don't know if they call it central bank, but like a bank office in Vienna. It was kind of funny because I was basically giving a presentation saying why the central bank shouldn't exist or something. But anyway, so it was interesting. All right, well, I think maybe, Paul, for the benefit of the listeners here, maybe I'll just read the abstract of your paper and then we can start going through. Obviously, we're not going to get into like equation 16 says such and such, but maybe just to give them the big picture. So the title is An Austrian, and Austrian's in quotation marks, Model of International Specialization. So it's Paul, and then you've got a co-author, Adrian Koleza, also from Harvard. And here's the abstract. We develop a general equilibrium model of international trade in which the temporal structure of production is a key determinant of comparative advantage. Building on Böhm-Bawerk's theory of capital, the model formalizes the idea that production processes with longer average periods of production, or APPs, entail higher financing costs due to the time lag between input payments and revenue realization. We embed this insight into a multi-sector Ricardian framework with endogenous interest rates. Under autarky, countries with more patient consumers or more developed financial markets exhibit lower equilibrium interest rates and higher wage rates. With international trade, these countries typically gain a comparative advantage in sectors with longer APPs, though the model can also generate multiple equilibria and unconventional specialization patterns. We extend the framework to include trade costs, global value chains, and international capital market integration. And then finally, empirically, we present evidence showing that countries with more developed financial systems export disproportionately more in sectors with longer APPs, even after controlling for standard neoclassical and institutional determinants of comparative advantage. All right, so
made me realize that I need to make it shorter.
It was there's probably some sort of period of it was a roundabout exposition or summary of your paper. Okay, so I was going to be kind of snarky and say like, so it's like Böhm-Bawerk meets Krugman. Let me explain what I mean by that, and then you can tell me like whether that's kind of right, or if like, no, that's totally wrong. But just because I think some of the listeners don't even know in terms of like modern trade. Like, for example, Paul Krugman wins a Nobel Prize for his work on international trade. And if you read some of his stuff where he's kind of like giving a big picture summary of what has changed, I think part of it is something like this, where, for example, in the case of the U.S., we can understand why if you're looking at Alaska versus Florida, Florida's going to send them oranges and Alaska's going to send them oil. That like just makes sense. And that's, why is that? Well, it's obvious because of natural endowments. But more generally, you could have two identical regions with the workers are exactly identical, whatever, at time zero. And if there are economies of scale in the production technology, just through happenstance, if one country goes down one path and another goes down a different path, you can see why 20 years later, they each have comparative advantages in different things and they specialize and export to each other, not because the terrain or the resource endowments were different, but just because, path dependence and one thing specialized in one versus the other. So, partly the models, modeled things like that and, combine different types of literatures. So is what you're doing just a particular example of that latter approach where you're saying one of the things that could make one country, specialize in certain things is historically they've invested in longer production processes?
Yes and no. Okay. So everything you said is absolutely correct. It's a very nice description of some of Paul Krugman's work. I would say yes, in the sense of we have the what we call neoclassical theories of specialization, Ricardian models, the Hechelin models. And then the Krugman, what I'd like to call the Helpman-Krugman revolution, so-called new trade theory, was motivated by facts that we didn't see in the data, that were visible in the data that were not rationalizable with neoclassical models. And you give a very good example of scale economies or sort of history matters and things like that. So in that vein, yes, what we're doing here is saying some of the traditional determinants of comparative advantage, a notion of capital abundance, of skill abundance, coupled with differences in, say, skill intensity across sectors, are not sufficient in the sense that there's going to be residual variation in trade patterns that is explained by additional factors, right? And Krugman might be just accidents of nature or country size or something like that. Where I would say we're less close to Krugman is in the sense that our model is actually, other than this Böhm-Bawerk feature, it's absolutely neoclassical in the sense of having perfect competition, constant returns to scale. So there's no, every single assumption that Krugman built into models to kind of generate these new predictions, they're not there. Our model is actually in a lot of the papers in trying to argue that despite being a model in which we're going to have labor and capital, okay, as in the Hechelin model, which is one of the benchmark neoclassical models, the fact that we adopt this sort of Austrian notion of capital that is less tied to a homogeneous stock of physical capital, whatever that may be, and that would bring us to the famous capital controversies. If you think about capital as associated with working capital, with credit, which is necessary to kind of generate this sort of longer production length, then you get predictions, even in a otherwise neoclassical model, that are quite distinct. Okay, so that is what I would sort of draw the distinction that yes, it's a twist on neoclassical theory, but it's within neoclassical theory. And then there's more subtle issues, which is maybe there's a connection in Krugman in that we also have multiple equilibria. You refer to multiple equilibria. There are multiple equilibria that have to do with the nature of capital in this frameworks, which is very much an Austrian nature of capital, which is, emphasizes the dangers of aggregating capital into single things that may be convenient in some settings, but may lead to rule out situations that may well arise in equilibrium, which is what we illustrate in the paper.
Okay, great. Let me ask you this then. Is your baseline result, are you starting with identical regions and just showing if, except perhaps maybe for consumer preferences for the timing of consumption, and saying to people that are more patient, this is how that's going to unfold? Or is that not your approach? Like, do you
nailed it. That's
okay.
I mean, we do it more generally, but sort of the baseline case would be this one, where it's not like the two countries are completely identical. There is a, which in a Krugman world, you can generate trade in completely identical countries. Right. We need some difference. What's different here is that it's going to be coming from, as you said, exactly, patience. Doesn't need to be only patience. Our model allows for interest rate differences that are coming from variation in the efficiency of the financial system. In some countries, funds are transferred from savers to investors in a more efficient way, right? There's less loss along the way. That would also generate interest rate differences. But you need a little bit of a difference in that sense, okay? And that's going to generate differences in availability of financial capital across countries. And that generates the interest rate differences. And then the interest rate differences are going to affect the decisions of agents of just how long to kind of let production processes mature that are going to generate differences in production structure.
Okay. So again, I'm taking the readers along for the ride here, Paul. Okay. So I realize, yes, you cover a lot of stuff. I mean, it's 103 pages with a lot of appendices and stuff. So you cover a lot of material, but yes, one way of thinking of it is just to get to the listeners, and also like trained economists too, who are just curious, like, what are these guys doing? Do I want to check this paper out? So yeah, one baseline result is, again, two otherwise identical people, groups at time zero, except that the consumers in one, discount future utility less than the other ones do, and so they're willing to save more. that can cause these things. But now, am I right in thinking that, like, you could say, okay, but where's the Böhm-Bawerkian capital theory come in? So the production technology in your framework, the people input labor hours, and the gap, like the duration, like how long the labor hours are gestating in the production process before the finished good comes out. That's like one of the choice variables, right? And
yes, I mean, it's the Böhm-Bawerk, what do you call it? Böhm-Bawerkian? That's a big word. Aspect, yeah, comes from the link between the length of production, okay, how many periods, or I mean, we have continuous time, but it doesn't matter, just how the interval, how many seconds you spend in production, and the productivity. And that's a little bit of a history dependence of the paper, because in the initial version of the paper, which I started on my own, and by the way, Adrian, my co-author, is my student here, and he joined the team at some point. He was making great contributions, so it made sense to bring him along. We started with this link, right? Then if you read the current version of the paper, a lot of the results really are more about the time-phased nature of production. That some things, for whatever reason, they take longer than others, okay? And as long as there's interest rate differences across countries, obviously that's going to penalize longer production processes more than shorter ones if you're facing a higher interest rate. So, obviously the time phase nature of production is something that we associate with Böhm-Bawerk, but at some level it goes back to Ricardo and Marx. They wrote about that quite a bit. I mean, I think about Böhm-Bawerk as sort of really taking this idea and running with it and arguing, well, that happens, but it's also important for understanding productivity. You want to understand how interest rates are determined. This productivity effects might be relevant for that. So, that's in there, but a lot of it is more basic, linking to the capital controversy, which is the time phase nature of production, generates a lot of complications in thinking about what capital is and how you can aggregate it.
Okay, so then my next question, just to clarify exactly how the Böhm-Bawerkian, and I don't think I made that up, I think I've seen other people use that, element makes your approach distinct. Let me put it this way. Couldn't a standard neoclassical growth theorist say, what do you mean? Like, if you had a solo model or something, and then you posited that people had different intertemporal preferences, and you had them separated, I could see how the one people that they used to have a higher savings rate, so they accumulate more of the homogeneous capital stock, and that increases, the level of consumption. Anyway, is there some reason that no, if capital is homogeneous, even though saving more makes production higher 20 periods out, that doesn't give rise to the specific things you're seeing?
Right, great question. So you sound a bit like my referee.
Hopefully not referee too.
Yeah, you're referee too. I could tell. No, that's a good question. So the way I think it is as follows. If you take a solo model, which is a dynamic version of a model with a homogeneous K, that maps to the Hectorlin model, where also K is a homogeneous thing. And then you have predictions that say countries with lots of K relative to labor are going to produce and export capital-intensive goods. And you test the theory by trying to measure this big K at the country level, which is hard. And then at the production level, at the industry level, you'd want to get a measure of capital spending, like spending on structures, on equipment, etc., relative to labor payments, right? We're saying, maybe that might have some predictive power, but this story is different. It's like, don't try to measure physical capital. Maybe measures of credit over GDP, say, might be or measures of financial development, just how efficient financial systems are. This is the relevant country dimension. And at the industry or product level, what you want is not a measure of the capital intensity in a physical sense, but a measure of the, say, working capital intensity, or more directly, a measure of just how long, on average, this average period of production, how long does it take to kind of collect revenue relative to when you're spending on inputs, right? And that variation, you could say, well, isn't that physical capital intensity? It need not be. okay, that we show in the paper that this connection might break. And in the data, actually, surprisingly, we can talk more about empirically how we measure the APP. Our measure of the APP turns out to be negatively correlated with standard measures of physical capital intensity. So that's why I see empirically, it is a distinct source of comparative advantage. It's not about machines. It's not about buildings and things like that, enhancing productivity more in some sectors than others. It's really about the temporal dimension of production and the associated working capital needs and how it interacts with the financial system in different countries.
Okay. That is very interesting. And yeah, just so you know, Paul, and for the listeners too, you're right. I wanted to kind of work through like the theory and then a big chunk at the end. I want to give you time to explain empirically, like, why do you think this approach is fruitful? But let me read something from your paper that prompted me to ask you that, so you make sure you understand where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. You got this line: these peculiarities arise because while financial capital is homogeneous and freely mobile across sectors, the physical capital goods it finances are heterogeneous within and across sectors due to variation in the temporal structure of production. And so that's why I was wondering, like, is it how much do your results depend on, like, why your results differ from a standard model, that really you are not just assuming that, oh yeah, you can summarize the capital stock at time T with, big K subscript T, as opposed to there's, because that's just so you know, Paul, that's a standard thing that Austrians a lot of times when they're trying to explain to people, well, why should people care about the Austrian school? Almost says, because capital goods are heterogeneous, and some people are like, yeah, whatever. We kind of know that. And so anyway, that's partly why I'm wondering, like, how critical is that to what you're doing in this paper?
It depends on what you want to take from the paper, right? So if when we talk about the empirics and what we look into the data, what we find in the data, it would be this idea that indeed in the data, longer production processes tend to be carried out in countries with lower interest rates. I don't think those differences are crucial, okay, in the sense that we could have, this is a prediction that comes out very cleanly, precisely, when, even though measuring the aggregate K could be complicated, the natural way to aggregate them would deliver roughly the right answer. But in the paper, we also show that in situations in which that aggregation becomes trickier, the model generates a series of more surprising results. For instance, we show that it could be the case that countries with lower interest rates could actually end up producing goods that, when you measure working capital intensity, that working capital intensity is not higher. Okay, so that there's some sort of what we call ranking reversals that can arise in the situation. Perhaps more interestingly, whether a country, whether the more patient country, say, ends up with a lower interest rate or not, it's a bit less obvious. There's multiple equilibria. Because if you happen to be, and I'll try to explain this in plain words. Suppose you're a country with patient consumers, then you tend to think that in that country interest rates are going to tend to be lower. But suppose that leads to, according to the model, that country to specialize in lots of sectors that have long production processes. Well, that's going to entail a lot of demand for financial capital, because we need to sustain these long production processes. With limited capital mobility across countries, that's going to generate a lot of local demand for capital, which might bid up the interest rate. And it's not inconsistent that then you'd end up with a higher interest rate. But then you no longer have comparative advantage in these long production processes. Okay, so then you can get into these loops where you end up with a patient country actually with a higher interest rate, which is not something you'd get in like a solo-style looking neoclassical model. So, what we haven't done in the paper yet is, okay, what's the evidence for this sort of new, like completely new predictions that are hard to generate in neoclassical models. We haven't done that. The predictions we have, I'd say, are distinct from available frameworks because they tell us we should be measuring K, aggregate K, and the variation across sectors in working capital intensity differently than we had been doing in the Hextrolene model. But we are not testing the sort of funky results that we can get because of that thing.
Okay, fair enough.
Which just super quickly, I mean, you may know, there's this sort of related literature on reswitching effects. Samuelson had a very, summing up paper, classical paper showing funky stuff can happen when you think you can aggregate K and you can't, right? So we know that's true. And actually, Samuelson was one of the few people going on record saying, Joanne Robinson was right, Similarly, I guess the Austrians were right in that it's typically not possible to aggregate K. And here's proof of that. Now, the literature, as you say, they moved on. And people say, whatever. Why? Well, because maybe we think these are funky situations that are not typically arising. And, we understand it's all approximations, which is models are just an abstraction of reality. And yes, it's not exactly right, but maybe ballpark right. So I'm not sure I have a view on this, whether this sort of funky things that can arise here are first order importance or not. But we thought that this is interesting. We might as well lay it out. Maybe people will pick it up and test it in the future.
Okay, great. So you actually just segued right into one of the things I was going to ask you anyway, Paul. So let me bring the viewers along to make sure they're not getting lost. Okay, so partly why I was pleasantly surprised to see people, nowadays working on stuff and referring to the average period of production was that a standard history of thought treatment says this is just dead. Like Mark Blogg in his History of Economic Thought, I think this might not be an exact quote, but it's definitely close to it. When he's talking about Austrian capital theory, he says that this reswitching controversy was the nail in the coffin of Böhm-Bawerk's original conception. And so just for the people at home here, the big idea is, okay, if you take labor and natural resource inputs, and if you're willing to invest them in physical processes that take longer, in general, you can always find a higher physical yield, right? That if you want to get water out of the stream, if you just go with your bare hands and keep walking back and forth to your hut, you're not going to get many gallons per hour that way. But if you first take the time to go fashion a shovel and you dig a ditch and you do this and that, it might take you a year to get that whole thing up and running. But once you do, the amount of gallons per hour of your expenditure, all things measured, is much higher, right? So the longer you're willing to, make the production process take, the more yield you can get in physical terms for the amount of inputs you put in. Okay. And then Böhm-Bawerk, tries to link that to, so that's why a more capitalistic country that, they save more, they invest more in longer processes, they have a higher standard of living. And that kind of makes sense. But the reswitching controversy, what they discovered in the famous, Cambridge Capital controversies in the mid 20th century, is that you can come up with very simple examples. And Samuelson came up with a simple one. And he was throwing in the towel, by the way. He had been on the wrong side of the debate originally and said, okay, yep, these critics were right. Saying that you can imagine a production thing where at high interest rates, one production process is favored over another, and then in an intermediate range of interest rates, it flips that a different one is more cost effective. But then if you push interest rates down even more, it flips back to the other one. And so he's saying there's no unambiguous way to rank production processes in terms of being more or less capitalistic in physical terms. Hence this story to try to connect like, the capitalists save more, it lowers interest rates, and that's good for the workers, and that kind of justifies ideologically the interest payments to the cat. Like, no, that's all crazy because we can just show that doesn't work in general. So I'll stop there, Paul. And then, Blogg said, right, see, nail in the coffin. Böhm-Bawerk was wrong. Do something else if you want to talk about capital and interest theory. And so you guys are bringing that up again. So what's going on?
Yeah, no, I mean, two answers. So the short one is sort of, discarding a theory because of sort of some unconventional results that can happen in particularly carefully chosen examples. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a conclusion that you can draw. And you could do the same with solo style aggregate K theory and Hectorlin models. If you have things called factor intensity reversals, which can absolutely happen with well-behaved production functions, that also generates all sorts of funky results. And we didn't discard the theory because of that. Okay, so that's answer number one. Answer number two, perhaps more constructively. So part of what we do in the paper is formally derive an APP measure, which is not new, actually. It's somewhat distinct from the Böhm-Bawerk one because of continuous discounting, like the compounding of interest rates. Mm-hmm. But this is something that actually you can trace it back at least to Hicks, his Value and Capital, 1939. He has chapters on the average period of production and shows exactly how one should measure it with properly with discounting. And what we show, which we were very excited about, we thought we were the first ones to point this out. And then I found a paper, I'll tell you the story later, in a 1970s paper, that makes it very clear that this notion of the average period of production, despite all these things that you mentioned with Samuelson and stuff, there's always a very tight connection between this definition of the APP and how interest rates affect production costs. Okay, technically, I don't know if you want technical stuff, but what we call the semi-elasticity of the unit cost of production to the interest rate, D log C over DR, that is exactly equal to this definition of the APP. Okay, which tells you that if you want to measure how sensitive costs are to interest rates, formally, that is exactly what you want to be measuring. And it's a formal definition that is very much tied to Böhm-Bawerk, except for this sort of better treatment of compounding, which can trace it back to Hicks. Okay, and that's very important because in neoclassical trade theory, that derivative, how factor costs, in this case interest rates, affect costs, is what determines comparative advantage. If a country has comparative advantage in capital-intensive goods, is because changes in the rental rate of capital affect capital-intensive goods more than labor-intensive goods. That sensitivity is key. And that's a sense in which, yes, the APP, we're aggregating all this complicated stuff into a number for a production process, right? It's an object, it's a real number. But that's actually the key thing to figure out where that thing should be produced, okay? If it's in a high or low interest rate country. So that's a sense in which, even though funky stuff can happen, okay, and I alluded to Samuelson in terms of multiple equilibria, this and that, the link between interest rates and where high or low APP sectors should be produced, that is not subject to kind of funky counterexamples. So that's a sense in which and by the way, Hicks, but I have it in front of me. I'm sure you're familiar with Peter Lewin. Lewin, is that?
Yeah, and Nicholas Kachanowski.
Yeah, they have a very nice paper, which I also discovered in this, and which we cite, which makes a very similar type of point. Like, actually, it's not that. Okay, I don't think they make this semi-elasticity point that I'm mentioning, which is key in our paper. But I didn't get a sense reading that paper. These are pretty well-known Austrian economists. I didn't get a sense that the APP was dead. Okay, that there was at least a sub-community of the Austrian school that was still believing in this concept.
Oh, yeah, I may have overspoke there. Right. So for folks, so Peter Lewin and Nicholas Kachanowski, and I've had Nicholas on. Well, I've interviewed Peter as well. And right, that's one of the things they do. They do a lot on like the intersection of financial economics and Austrian capital theory. And yeah, one of their things was to say, if you giving a way that you can correctly deal with the average period of production in a way that isn't subject to these reversals, and it does what you want. Also, Paul, just as a fun anecdote, there's this Austrian economist, Roger Garrison. He recently passed, and his original training had been in engineering. And so one of his complaints was, he said that, economists don't keep track of units, and that used to annoy him in the capital literature, that they didn't keep the units consistent. But he always thought the capital reswitching thing was like a big nothing burger, because he said, yeah, that's just showing that a quadratic, the quadratic formula has two solutions, like big deal, So he never thought that was a big deal one way or the other. Okay, so I thank you for going. I'm glad I asked you that to go through that. So maybe can you, and you kind of already said it a little bit, but just for completeness, can you summarize to say if someone's like, well, okay, what's the payoff? Why do I want to wade through this paper? Empirically, what kind of things do you think that your approach can shed light on? Whereas again, the standard explanations from the neoclassical or even the new trade theory people don't quite fit the patterns that we see in some of the data out there.
Right. So there's a narrow goal of the paper, like a takeaway, and then a broader one. The narrow one is, yes, maybe we've missed that when thinking about capital and how it shapes specialization, international specialization, we might not just want to stick to this hexaroline physical capital idea, and we want to envision a notion where capital matters in a way that interacts with the duration of production. And empirically, part of the contribution, less of this paper, because we just borrow this measure from a different paper I wrote with a different grad student, Vitaly Tubdanov. We suggest a way to measure this notion of duration, which is, I mean, if you think about it, it's hard, right? So if you go back to the Vixel timber examples of like the trees that are growing, you gave a somewhat different example, but the same notion that if I wait longer for the tree to grow, I'm going to get more timber. I mean, you could imagine for particular sectors being very careful about how long they last, how long time improves their productivity. Think about whiskey, right? Or wines, where we could get a sense of just how much productivity improves with time. Instead, we just sort of take a different approach, which is partly motivated by theory, which is in the model, variation in the APP should correspond to variation in things we can observe. Okay, and in particular, what we show, and it sort of goes back to work that you may have seen Robert Dorfman, who taught at Harvard for many years, worked a little bit on this sort of Austrian models, and we kind of got the idea from there, which is use data, inventory data. Okay, so if you are a firm that is producing things instantly, very, very quick production runs, you're going to produce and spit out of the factory like all the time, right? So there's going to be very little stuff sitting as inventory. When you are producing wine, say, and you have all these barrels that have different maturities and so on, you've got a lot of inventory in house. Okay, so that it's sort of natural that inventory, and in particular what we call work in process inventory, not like raw materials or finished product inventories, but this sort of work in process, that's very much tied to this notion of there's a semi-finished product that is at the factory, okay, or whatever plant, and there's still added value being added. So we have data for that. I mean, inventories data are widely available. And what we show is that the APP is very close in the data under some stationary conditions. It's very, it should be captured by the ratio of inventories to the cost of goods sold. Okay. And then those are two things that are always in financial data you can find for any publicly traded company. That's very easy to do. Mm-hmm. And with Vitaly, we just went and measured this. We measured this for all the firms in CompuStat, US, various countries. We explored variation that was, the extent to which firms in different sectors, like all the winemakers, are going to tend to have like larger duration than all the milk producers. Okay. And indeed, we tend to see that there's a big sectoral component to these measures. There's a lot of variation. If you look at the top longer production processes and the shorter ones, it kind of makes sense. You can kind of sense that there's a temporal, this industry is different in a lot of ways, but it does look like the temporal dimension of production matters. I think tobacco was one of the top 5 longest production processes. That had me a bit confused. And then at some point I gave a talk somewhere and people said, no, it makes a lot of sense. You need to put them in the sun. Or I don't know anything about tobacco, but they were telling me, that makes sense. Actually, it actually takes a while to do these things. So that's how we came to this measure. And then indeed, it does look in the data that longer production processes, if you look at exports of countries at the country and sector level, countries with lower interest rates tend to export disproportionately of this, what we've measured being a longer production process. It's a statistical result. If you want to find counterexamples, I'm sure you'll find them. It's sort of on average, this has predictive power. And quite a bit of predictive power, comparable to like other standard determinants of comparative advantage, like skill intensity, skill abundance, interactions. That's in a nutshell what we do.
Okay, fantastic. So, of course, folks, I'll put a link to Paul's paper.
That'd be awesome.
The version submitted. That'd be great. We just have a few minutes here left, Paul. I have to ask you, and this is like we're chasing ratings here, or whatever. But given I was looking over your CV and how much in general you've done, like on supply chains and things like, even in the agricultural sector. Do you mind just sharing your thoughts? The Strait of Hormuz, and there's different things, like a lot of the analysts, not just professional economists, but just guys who write like newsletters for financial people and whatnot. They're just going over the raw facts about like the interruption, not just of crude exports, but fertilizer and things like that. And yet it seems like market prices are not nearly as worried about things as these analysts are. Do you have any comments on that?
I have comments. I'm not sure. I'm perhaps a little bit less comfortable talking about these things than about semi-elasticities. Let me just say, I'll answer the question. Let me just say one thing that I left hanging, and I don't want to leave it hanging, which is before in the previous question, you were asking me about what I draw conclusions, right, or ways forward. And I mentioned this one about here's a new measure of duration. The broader point I wanted to make is which I think should be exciting for folks in your school of thought, is that I do think that some of these ideas of the duration of production, the links between time and productivity, they have much broader applicability than just sort of figuring out the implications for trade flows. And that's, by the way, that is my sense. This is a paper that I've presented in many, many places, many audiences, some international trade audiences. But talking to macroeconomists, they find this stuff very interesting. Okay, so you might have the view that sort of economists of this neoclassical tradition, they're sort of built on these ideas and they're immutable. No, I think people understand that these ideas, there was some power in some of these ideas, that it's complicated, perhaps, to work with models with heterogeneous capital. But, there's a lot of, I sense interest and sort of leads me to believe that maybe there might be broader applicabilities and that people are going to start thinking harder and harder about, time, an explicit notion of time and how it shapes production, how it shapes interest rates, which is sort of, at some level, one way to kind of one of the key ideas in Böhm-Bawerk's work. Anyway, that I wanted to leave that.
Which is why guys like me should not be snarky on Twitter when you see someone talking
it's
about
Twitter.
it.
I mean, this is supposed to be.
Do you ask a bird not to fly? Come on.
I've been snarky there too. That's the way that platform operates. And I didn't. I didn't take it badly at all. Okay. Hormuz. It's I think I've been surprised, as you have, about us not having seen more of a direct impact of this right away. I mean, we just saw the inflation number. I don't know if you've seen it. We just got inflation numbers today, 4.2%. Okay, so we are certainly seeing price action now. Why? Because it's well understood in this modeling of production networks that even though oil is a relatively small input into most production processes, there's not in the short run there's not a lot of substitution. Okay, so you might end up with price effects that are large. Maybe they're going to take a while. There's other work that shows that all prices are going to take a while to kind of transmit to different parts of production, and you can have models of why that is, in the sense of maybe the direct production cost is not very large, but it's affecting me when I drive around, and then I'm paying so much. I need higher salaries. That's gonna lead me to ask for a salary increase. That's gonna, wherever I produce, that's gonna. So there's all these rounds of adjustment that might lead to prices not just going up immediately, but slowly, but more worrisomely. And that's why I think a lot of expectations about rate increases at the Fed might come, which is that this is not something that's going to disappear the day after the war is over. Okay, so that's very focused on oil and prices, but I know that's where a lot of the discussion is. I think in terms of more global commerce, I'm perhaps a little bit less surprised that there has been less of an effect, because that's sort of, I think for oil, it's a particularly important bottleneck. For other commodities, I think it is less so. I've seen data though about like shipping prices going up a lot too. So I'm not saying, I'm not sort of trivializing that this might lead to a bigger shock that we've witnessed so far. But it's, but again, I would imagine with shipping costs, something very similar than with oil would have. It's a small part of cost, but it might take a few rounds of sort of updating wages and this and that for it to end up showing up. Yeah, and then there's, if you need to have an oil expert to speak about that, but obviously there's been like adjustments on reserves and things like that have attenuated the response. And in the case of the U.S., the U.S. is a net exporter of oil, right? So in the country where we are, economic theory might suggest that on aggregate, that's not necessarily a bad thing, in the sense that the price of something we export on net is going up. That's a terms of trade gain.
Right.
That obviously will not resonate with people that are paying close to $100 to fill up their tanks these days.
Right. But the people who own the oil fields, they'll be happy.
Right. And I don't know. An interesting thing there is whether, to what extent these oil companies that are probably, their stock valuation is through the roof, to what extent are these U.S. owned? Or because as you know, there's a lot of foreign ownership of U.S. stocks. So I don't know that windfall. I don't know how much we're keeping of that. But obviously, the median individual in the U.S. is probably not cheering the higher gas prices right now.
Right.
But from a macro perspective, it's less obvious that this should be something that is having a negative impact on standard aggregates.
Right. Okay. Great stuff. So thank you for that. So, folks, my guest has been Paul Antràs. Paul, thanks so much for your time here and explaining your insights on this fascinating paper.
Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate the opportunity. And if your listeners have any feedback, any complaints, any ideas for future work, you guys know where to reach me. Thanks again for your time.
Okay, sure thing. And then, so folks, like I said, we'll link to his paper. Also, some stuff I've done on like the re-switching debate. If you want to see that spelled out, folks, we'll link to the show notes page. And thanks everybody for your attention. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.